Okay, so in my menu folder on the pages, I'm going to create a new component or page in there, which is going to chain on from slash menu. So this one is going to be called ID, but in array brackets like so. So this is essentially after we hit the menu page, forward slash anything after. So in this case, I'm going to name this ID. I'm now going to create the functional component, and instead of calling it brackets ID, I'm just going to call this page drinks information. Now, what we want to do is we want to get the API data from the API slash drinks forward slash whatever the product we click on. So for example, if we click on this product, we want to get this product's ID, which will be added onto here. So that product ID may be 12 or it may be 13 or so on. So at this stage, we are going to go back onto our next.js documentation. First off, I'm going to get static path. So I'm going to render out all the paths that contain the ID within. So in the drinks information page, I'm going to create an async function. This is because we are fetching data from the API. So export async function, and this is going to be get static paths like so. So we're getting all the paths of the product. In here, I'm going to get a response first of all. So const res is equal to await fetch, and in this fetch, we're going to get the drinks API. So the following here, so get static paths fetch API forward slash drinks, and then the drink, we're going to set a new constant called const drink data, where we pass the data into JSON. So await res dot JSON like so. So all I want to do now is console dot log drink data like so. Now if I save, and now if I go into menu slash 12, so we now have data coming through in the console log. So we now need to return the data. So if I return the path which we need to define, and I'm going to add a fallback of blocking. So if we go into next.js documentation, they do have a fallback in here of blocking. So this will serve rendered pages on demand if the path doesn't exist. So that's what we'll have. So to define the path, I'm going to create const path, which is equal to drink data dot map. So for each drink, I want to return an object, and in this object, I'm going to have access to something called params. So I'm going to define the params, and the params are going to have a key and a value. So the key will be called ID within an object. So ID, which is drink dot ID. So we are mapping through the drink data. For each drink, we're going to set an ID of drink ID. I'm just going to check. I think this might be a number. So what we want to essentially do is return it as a string. So if I do drink.id.toString like so, or we could wrap it in a string like so. And then what happens is we now are returning the path. I'm just going to call this paths with an S, so it's plural. So now we have all of the paths. The second part, what we need to do is get the static props now. So if we just copy, export async function once again, and this one is going to be getStaticProps, and within the getStaticProps, we're going to define the ID. So const ID is equal to the context dot params dot ID. I'm also going to get the context from here, and I'm going to console log what is in the context, text, and comment that out and save. If we open the terminal and scroll all the way to the bottom, and if we refresh the page, we are now getting back the params, as you can see, an ID of 12. So this one is 12. If we change that to an ID of 22 and went on that page, we now get an ID of 22, which is a string also. The params are defined in getStaticPaths. So as you can see here, we get our drink data from the API, we convert it to JSON, we get the paths, we map through the paths, we create a context object of params, which is being returned. So params.id will be a stringified version of drink.id. So now we have access to the context here. We now want to define the ID. So the ID is equal to the context.params.id like so. So now what we are going to do is create a new URL structure where the ID gets added on to the slash menu, and then that would pre-build the API for a certain drinks. For example, slash 13 would be the drink for white hot chocolate. So I'm going to create a constant named drink results. So we await fetch data. So I'm going to put template strings in here, so backticks, because this is going to be including the ID, which we have defined. So if we copy this structure here and paste that inside, the final part where the ID should be would contain selector, and inside would be the ID like so. And now we will fetch the data from slash menu slash ID. So now we have the drinks results fetching from this API. All we need to do now is pass this now to JSON. So we add a .then block, which gets the response, and then that response gets converted to JSON like so. And now we have finally the drink result. So we are now going to return the props within, which is going to be the drink results. And like we discussed earlier, we are also going to add the revalidate feature in as well. So this will attempt to regenerate the page either when a request comes in or every 10 seconds. So after my props here, I'm going to put a comma and paste in the revalidate. In our case, I'm going to add a revalidate of every 100 seconds. So now we are returning the drinks results. So in my drinks information component, we now get the drinks result. And if we console log the drinks result, and if I just say hello in this div and save, now we are going on menu slash 22 and we are getting hello. So it's essentially pre-built the page. If we go up to our folder structure and go into next and go into cache and server and into pages, we should have a menu folder here which has all the cached pages for the menu, and in this we have the ID. So now we have the hello. If we go into our console, we should get the same data as what we have in this API call. So we should have a coffee frostino with the same description, same large image, and so on. So if I go into my console, we now have an object with the frostino coffee and the ID of 22. So we are now getting the data through for the relevant ID. If I now search for the fifth ID, we will now get an updated page with the new information. So at this moment, it is a cappuccino we are looking at, and that is a coffee. And to verify this, if we go into API slash drinks slash number 5, that is now a cappuccino in a coffee category. So we are getting the data through. So what we are going to do in the next video is build this page here And once that is rendered and working correctly, we are then going to go back onto our drinks and link them together. And then we should have the menu section complete.